Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part 2 of the 6.2 notes video. So in this part, we're going to take a look at factoring by grouping. And I'm going to end up showing you guys a couple of different ways to do this, and you're going to have to pick which method you prefer. So for some polynomials, you can factor by grouping pairs of terms that have a common monomial factor. So the example right here might look a little bit complicated, but you have basically RA plus RB plus SA plus SB. Well, what's happening is the first two factors have R in common. So we're going to group those together and factor the R out. The last two terms have this S in common. So we're going to group them and factor out the S. Well, in each case, when we factor out R, we end up with A plus B inside our parentheses. When we factor out the S, we get A plus B inside our parentheses. Well, what ends up happening is now you've got this common factor that those have in common. So we essentially are going to factor out the A plus B right here, and then end up with R plus S left. So this can be a little bit confusing. It is important to recognize when to do this. We factor by grouping whenever there are 4 terms. So there is a pretty obvious indicator when to apply this method. So looking at number 6, we've got 4 terms: x cubed minus 3x squared minus 16x plus 48. They don't all have a greatest common factor. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and group these ones together, and we're going to group this together. Don't forget to include the sign in front of the number. From there, we want to try to figure out what do each group have in common. Between x cubed and negative 3x squared, they have this x squared. And then the other factor would end up being x minus 3. If you look at the negative 16x and the 48, they have a negative 16 in common. So that's the greatest common factor between those two. And then you would have x minus 3 inside the parentheses as well. So then what you hopefully will recognize is that there's an x minus 3 in both of these. So you're going to end up with two factors: x squared minus 16, which is coming from here and here, and x minus 3. Now in this example, you need to also recognize that x squared minus 16 is a difference of squares. So that right there is going to factor into conjugates, x plus 4 and x minus 4. And then the x minus 3 is already factored as far as it's going to go. So with the grouping method, that's how you would factor that problem. The alternative approach is called the box method. So the box method can be a useful tool when you have 4 terms. And the way that it works is you start with a 2x2 box. We kind of did the box with some multiplication in the other notes. But if you start with the 2x2 box, instead of the terms going on the outside, now they're going to go inside. So the first term always goes in the upper left, and you basically fill it left to right, top to bottom. So it's x cubed, negative 3x squared. The negative 16x goes here, and the 48 goes here. Once you have the pieces in the box, I've seen people do this different ways, but the way I always do it is I always start by pulling out my first factor to the left. So x cubed and negative 3x squared, they have x squared in common. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom row. The negative 16x and the 48, they have a negative 16 in common. So whatever sign's in front, I want to take that out. Now, in order to figure out what goes on top, there's kind of 2 ways to do it. One way is you could factor out the GCF this way. So what do x cubed and negative 16x have in common? Well, they have x in common. this way, what do negative 3x squared and 48 have in common? Well, they have negative 3 in common. I personally don't like to do it that way. What I always do is I just look at what's in front here. I have x squared, I need x cubed. So what goes on top? X. X squared times x gives me x cubed. And then with the x squared out here, what do I need to multiply by to get negative 3x squared? That's how I come up with the negative 3. But either way you do it, what you want to double check is that when you multiply what's here and here, you get what's in the first box. When you multiply this x by the negative 16, you need to get what's in this box. And then when you multiply negative 3 by x squared, you get here, negative 3 and negative 16, you get this. As long as that checks out, you know that it's factorable. In this method, your factors are on the outside. So x squared minus 16, right? That was the, whoops. So one of our factors was x squared minus 16. And then you have the x minus 3. You still do need to recognize that x squared minus 16 is a difference of squares. So that's going to factor into conjugates. X plus 4, x minus 4, and you got x minus 3. So what the box does is it just gives us another method, another way to organize the problem and group them. Because you're still grouping the x cubed and the negative 3x squared together. We're just doing it within the structure of the box. Pick one of those methods and stick with it. All right. I'm going to go ahead and do example 7 without the box. You can always kind of rewatch that and apply the box to it if you want. But it's always a good idea to pause the video and try this on your own as well. All right, so now, looking at the 4 terms, there's not something that all 4 of them have in common. So you would group these and you would group these. Looking at 8t squared and 28ts, I noticed that they have a 4t in common. So inside parentheses, it's going to be 2t plus 7s. Again, when you distribute the 4t, you need to get those 2 terms. Looking at the next set of pairs, negative 6ts, negative 21s squared. Well, they have a negative in common. 6 and 21 have a 3 in common. Ts and s squared have s in common. So there's your GCF from that group. Inside the parentheses, negative 3s times 2t gives me this negative 6ts. And then negative 3s plus 7s gives us this. If factoring by grouping is going to work, what's inside the parentheses here will also be inside the parentheses here. So what that gives us is 4t minus 3s. That's coming from here and here. And then 2t plus 7s. That's coming from here and here. You're basically factoring out the common factor of 2t plus 7s is the idea in that problem. All right, one more example, and then we will move on. So in this one, again, you've got 4 terms. There is not anything that they all have in common. So we're going to group. We'll group the first 2. We'll group the last 2. So looking at the first 2, I noticed that they have 2x squared in common. And then I would need x minus 3. Remember, you're just distributing to get what's in these parentheses. Now this one might not be obvious, but with positive x and negative 3, all they have in common is 1. So I take out the 1 because I have to take something out. And then you're going to have x minus 3. Well, there's that x minus 3, x minus 3. So we're going to end up with 2x squared plus 1 coming from here and here, and x minus 3. Neither one of those factors anymore, so that is it. So that's how you're going to factor by grouping. And again, you have the choice of the box method, or you can factor by grouping the way we showed you. We're going to go back up to that box at the beginning of the notes. We'll fill this in, and then guys get started on your homework after this. All right, so we're going to group those two and group those two because there's nothing that they all have in common. The first two have an x squared in common, and we're going to be able to factor out, or when we factor out the x squared, we get x plus 6. The last two have -3 in common, and the other factor is going to be x plus 6. So again, here's that x plus 6 in both places. So we're going to be able to essentially factor that out, leaving us with x squared minus 3 and x plus 6. You would want to double check to see if x squared minus 3 will factor anymore, but because 3 is not a perfect square, you can leave your answer just like this. All right, guys, I hope you found these videos helpful. You can watch them as many times as you need to, but make sure your notes are filled out and then work on your 6.2 homework.